Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to DNN, the Doomers News Network, where we give you the unwashed truth, free of all the cheerleading and empty platitudes that you get in the mainstream financial press. Here, we just give you the doom, the whole doom, and nothing but the doom. And with me, I have Miss Melody right today. Melody, how we doing?
Doing well, Jack. How are you doing?
I am doing great. It's a fine day to run with the doom, and we have plenty going on in the world to talk about, don't we, today?
We absolutely do. Never a lack of things to talk about.
Not at all. Well, why don't we just get right in? Well, first of all, why don't you tell us what are the stories that we have to talk about today, Melody? Give us a brief preview of what we're going to see on this stream and podcast, because we're on Spotify now also.
I know, very exciting. So welcome back, everybody. You'll notice that our pal Travis is not with us today. He's out there gallivanting in Galveston on one of his shark fishing trips. So unfortunately, he won't be with us, but we are going to share a little, a little message from him from his trip. So today, what we're going to be talking about, we're going to start with a story on. First, we'll do our kind of review of the important stories of the week in doom, and then we'll move to Hurricane Beryl, or I'm not sure how you say it. What's going on in Houston? There's still over 800,000 customers without power. We'll then transition over to a story about, I think I got the order wrong, Jack, but I'll just keep talking. We're going to talk about Japan. We're going to do a follow on our story on Steward Healthcare from last week. Very important. In many ways, what we're doing here, guys, talking about stories, laying the foundation for stories that we think are going to be important over the next several months. And so you'll hear more and more about them as we move forward. And then we'll also have a story on the government grift in Medicaid, which Jack will bring you. I'm very excited to hear myself. And so looking forward to just bringing the news to you guys today, giving you more of a deep dive than what you're hearing out there in regular media. So back over to you, Jack.
All right. Thank you, Melody. And with that, we are going to start with our first segment, which is becoming something of a tradition here on the channel. We are going to start with This Week in Doom. And yes, that is me playing with my new soundboard. But it was one heck of a week in the world of doom. Starting on Monday, a story that was near and dear to our buddy Travis, who again is not with us today, largely because of the fallout from this. Hurricane Beryl made landfall as a Category 1 in Matagorda, Texas on Monday afternoon, causing severe flooding and wind damage, leaving at least 13 dead in the Houston area. And as of 3 hours ago on today, July 13th, 2024, 680,000 people remain without power in the Houston area, something Melody is going to be talking about in much more detail momentarily here after this segment rolls. And beyond that, we've also had on Tuesday, BP, British Petroleum stock, took a hammering after announcing that they'll be taking somewhere between a $1 billion and $2 billion write-down of their Gelsenkirchen refinery. That's an oil refinery in Germany that was built in 1935. And BP is having a hard time competing with much cheaper imports from places like the Middle East and Asia, where investments in energy infrastructure are being made, and yet European energy infrastructure continues to atrophy, largely because of environmental regulations and other higher expenses. And then also we got on Monday, Boeing announced that they will be pleading guilty to corporate fraud for violating the terms of a deferred prosecution agreement from 3 years ago, stemming from two crashes of the 737 MAX that killed 346 people. Under the agreement, Boeing had agreed that they would make a doubling down commitment to safety and transparency in exchange for not being prosecuted for those two fatal crashes. And of course, that all came to a screeching halt with the Alaskan Airlines flight that saw that door panel blow out and the ensuing cover-up from the company that saw them stonewalling investigators and deleting camera footage of the work that was done on that panel. Now, under the terms of this new agreement, Boeing will pay a fine of $243.6 million. They'll commit to an independent monitor being named by the FAA who will oversee safety and quality for the next 3 years. And they're also going to be required to make $455 million in investments in safety and compliance over the next 3 years. No executives will be prosecuted under this agreement, although I would add that this agreement is not exclusive. It doesn't rule out future criminal prosecutions of any individuals. Then on Wednesday, we got news from OpenAI that tech giants Apple and Microsoft will both be abandoning plans for observer-only board seats on the board of OpenAI. This is as antitrust regulators circle overhead, looking closely at the agreements and the arrangements and the business dealings between big tech and AI startups. And most famously, those board seats that Microsoft took on OpenAI's board was following the rebellion by OpenAI's founders and other board members against Sam Altman back in December, where Microsoft sided with Altman, ultimately leading to all of those rebelling board members resigning from the company. On top of that, we had the NATO summit on Thursday, where the emperor's new clothes continued to dazzle the world. It was meant to be a showcase of the strength of the military and alliance between the various NATO countries. And of course, it turned into a slush fest about the ongoing cognitive decline of President Biden, where, among other things, we learned about Ukrainian President Putin, who the president introduced, and of course, the comments about Vice President Trump that President Biden made. And I believe it was Michael Knowles who said it best on Twitter. My main takeaway from this press conference is that President Biden and Vice President Trump have done a marvelous job supporting President Putin of Ukraine. Then on Thursday and Friday, we got inflation data in the United States, and it was quite a story. First of all, on Thursday, the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, came out, and it was reported as a 3.0% increase year over year, which is down sharply from the 3.3% reading we got last month, and lower than the 3.1% that was expected. On a month-over-month basis, CPI came in at 0.1% month-over-month. That's down from 0.0% last month, and also much lower than the positive 0.1% expected. So we actually had a negative monthly print for CPI. Now, most of the decline in the index was led by a decline in the energy index that saw a 3.8% monthly decline in the price of gasoline. That was, of course, offset by further increases in the shelter index, although it is worth pointing out that the shelter index rose by 0.2% last month, which is after several consecutive months of 0.4% increases. So we did get a smaller increase in the price of shelter, which many analysts have predicted for several months. Then yesterday on Friday, we got the producer price index, which was pretty much the opposite story of the CPI. That actually came in higher at 2.6% year over year, up from the 2.4% last month and much higher than the 2.3% that was expected. I would also add that last month's numbers were revised higher. On a monthly basis, PPI came in at 0.2% month over month, up from the revised 0.0% last month and more than the 0.1% expected. We actually saw some negative movement in the final prices of goods produced, although that was more than offset in big increases in the prices of services, which are being driven largely by wage gains. And of course, last but not least, we got the U.S. Consumer Sentiment Index from the University of Michigan on Friday, and that showed a pretty big decline to 66, down from 68.2 last month and well below the 68.5 that was expected. Now, a lot of analysts have been expecting this sentiment index to start improving as inflation readings have come down over the prior months. But as we can see in this index, the consumer does not seem to care much about the declines in the rate of change, i.e. the consumer price index. They're more worried about absolute price levels, which are still going up, albeit slower. And there were some pretty powerful quotes here. Despite expecting inflation to ease, consumers remain vociferously frustrated at the persistence of high prices, said Joanne Su, director of the survey. Almost half of consumers spontaneously expressed complaints that high prices are eroding their living standards, matching the all-time high reached 2 years ago. And I would add that 2 years ago, the consumer price index was around 9%, the all-time high, or not the all-time high, the recent high. And although inflation has come down sharply to just 3% now, the number of people who are complaining about inflation matches that all-time high from back then in 2022. Because again, it's more about the absolute price level and not the rate of change that the academics and the economists tend to focus on. And lastly, we got bank earnings from some of the big mega banks on Friday: JP Morgan, Wells Fargo, and Citigroup. And while the earnings were mixed, we did see a couple of consistent themes. We saw net interest income, which is the difference between what the banks earn on their loans and what they pay out on deposits. We saw that come down for all three banks that reported. We also saw increases in investment banking and trading revenues as the stock market and derivatives trading continues to be at ridiculous highs as people YOLO into 0-day to expiration call options. We've also seen an uptick in merger and acquisition activity, notably in the energy space. And several banks reported large one-time benefits from the share of Visa sales related to Visa's IPO from years ago. They're finally starting to cash in on those. So that was causing a one-time bump to the earnings. And I would also add that large credit losses and provisions for credit losses are on the rise at all the banks as they set aside more cash for the event of more people defaulting on their loans. And the last little bit I would share about this story comes near and dear to our hearts from our buddy Travis, who suffered this debilitating injury at the hands of a shark. Doctors are not optimistic about Travis's chances. That boo-boo on his finger was really felt around the world. Travis, we're all pulling for you, brother. Good luck, and we hope you are well. And that, folks, has been your This Week in Doom. And that's all I got for you, Melody. What do you think? What's going on this week? You're still muted, Mel. Happens to all of us. Don't worry.
It happens to all of us, doesn't it? And I would like to take a couple of seconds to talk about bank earnings because, that provision, this is I think something that we've been waiting for some time is to see the banks take that provision for loan loss. What is that? So essentially what happens, you have to take an allowance for loan loss or for credit loss on your books as a bank. And to do that, you have to take it through the income statement through a line called provision. And so this is not a good sign about what's going on in in the economy and with the consumer particularly. And a lot of times, things have changed since I was the one that were on these risk committees. We're figuring out what provision to take, what our allowance for loan loss balance should be. But I could tell you that typically you start, if something goes 30 days delinquent, you're starting your provision early because you need that allowance for future loss. And so this is this is to see these large numbers means that I think that we are coming around the corner to where people are going to have to admit where the consumer really is. And so, I thought this was a very interesting story this week to see the banks finally taking hits here.
Yeah, it's important to point out the accounting of how this works. When banks set aside additional money for credit losses, they're basically putting that money away for a rainy day. That comes directly out of their earnings for the quarter. So it makes their earnings appear lower when you see those bigger provisions for credit losses. And vice versa, when the banks say we're going to take a lower provision for credit losses, it makes those earnings look bigger as that money goes back into the earnings column. And it's kind of important to note that last quarter, very mysteriously, most of the big banks reduced their provisions for credit losses, even though delinquencies and defaults were on the rise, albeit slowly, but they were rising in virtually every category. And so the banks lowered those provisions. It made their earnings look a little better than they really were, and their stocks did okay on that. And now here we are, the defaults continue to rise. And of course, they've got that big sale of Visa stock that most of the banks took that's bumping their earnings back up. And so they've got cover. Now they can increase their provisions for credit losses, and then they can still get their headline about beating earnings expectations. And I would add that especially in the case of JP Morgan, the provisions that they're taking now are much bigger than the reductions from last month. So the banks are playing some games with their earnings here, kind of juking the stats to make things look better, and then under cover of this Visa story, making it look a little bit worse. But the underlying risk in markets, the decline, the delinquencies and the defaults, they continue to creep up, again, at a very slow pace still. But that's important to point out.
Absolutely.
All
So
right.
more to come, I think, and as we watch the banks over the next 6 months.
All right. And as we move on now, I think we're probably done with the This Week in Doom segment. I think we can move on now. And we've got Melody is going to share with us some information about Hurricane Beryl and the situation on the ground that, again, is really plaguing our buddy Travis as we speak. Melody, take it away.
Absolutely. So I hope everyone actually checked out Travis's video of sort of his personal experience in the hurricane. And, Jack and I were in contact with Travis throughout that, and we're very concerned about him, and he tried to allay our fears and say, I'm prepared for anything. He sent us some funny pictures of his provisions, his MREs and things he was going to use to protect himself. But in reality, I think what you'll see in his video is that he was not adequately prepared. And I think that is what all of Houston is actually experiencing right now. And so first, what I'm going to do is just take us through the timeline, because there was a lot of misinformation. I think what we're going to be hearing, this is eerily familiar in many ways to me. And I'm going to make a shocking sort of comparison that probably isn't going to make a lot of sense right now, but just kind of the way that we're seeing response. And that's Katrina. At first everybody thought it wasn't a big deal. And then as the days unfolded, as more stories came out, we realized what a big deal that hurricane really was to New Orleans. And so I'm getting similar vibes from Houston. Additionally, my buddy Julius Miami, who is with us today, he's been through several hurricanes, and he's pretty much been ahead of the game, telling me, okay, this is when we're going to start getting this press conference. This is when this is going to happen. But it is quite the debacle in Houston. So first, I'm just going to start off with what happened and perhaps why Houstonians were not as prepared as they should be. And Jack, if you want to share my screen, we can go ahead and share slides. So just talking from a story from the Houston landing, and of course, the blame and shame has already started, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But there was a lot of misinformation about Beryl, and I'm trying to say it the way you do, Jack. It reminds me of Merle from The Walking Dead.
I'm
But
having a hard time getting your screen shared, Melody. It says we're showing it right now, but I don't see it.
I see it, Jack.
You see it on screen?
I do.
No, I don't
Yeah.
see it. I got the stream rolling here. I'm going to remove it from the stream, Melody, and
Okay.
take it off the backstage. Do me a favor and share it again. Okay. I just boot. Oh man. See, this is what happens when Travis is on vacation. All right. I boot people from the stream accidentally. And now here I am trying to carry the show while Melody logs back in. Hopefully she's going to do that quick, because I do not have information shared ready to go about Melody. Somebody mentioned while Melody's coming back in that they had lived through Katrina in New Jersey. I'll tell you the quick anecdote. I lived through Katrina in New Jersey as well. Back in the day, not Katrina. Oh my God, I'm all over the place. I went through Sandy in New Jersey as well. And we were without power for about a week after Sandy. And I got my Coleman camp stove out. I was cooking on propane, and I had my percolator going, making coffee. And it turns out I had friends I didn't even know about, because when the rumor got out that I was the only one in the neighborhood with hot coffee, everybody remembered how good a friend Jack was, and they all came and knocking. And I've never made so much coffee in my life as I did during the power outage of Hurricane Sandy. Now, Melody, I apologize profusely for booting you from the show.
That's okay.
That was pretty awkward, and that was totally my fault. Now we're going to add your screen, and we can see it. And I'm going to take my hands off the panel before I break something else.
And no worries. And we'll just take this opportunity to say we miss you, Travis.
Yep. Could have used you there, Travis.
He's typically our captain in these things. Okay, so just to go over the facts, Hurricane Beryl slammed in the Texas coast on Monday, essentially knocking out more than 2 million homes in terms of power. And this was the first time that a Category 4 hurricane that we know about happened in the month of June. So, this is, we're not going to talk about climate change here, but, this definitely and this could largely due to changing, and we'll talk about this, the pattern from an El Nino to a La Nina in terms of why we're seeing these storms escalate and what this season is going to look like. But this was a very interesting thing that I found out in my research for this, that essentially X, labeled a June 27th AccuWeather forecast of the storm in the Caribbean that would become Beryl. Misinformation. I think that's really weird. And AccuWeather kind of, reached out and said, "Hey, what's going on?" But they really couldn't hear. They didn't hear anything back from the company. And so, guys, in times like this, when you have such I mean, we never know. And I think a lot of people talk about overblowing stories about these storms, somehow weather has become completely politically divisive when in reality, whatever you may feel about climate change or whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter because this is about our safety. And so we have to be able to talk about these things. And so part of me wonders what, this kind of misinformation label, what really impact that had. But let's just go over kind of the history of the storm. So on June 28th, it kind of forms as a tropical depression, but within 24 hours, it's intensifying with winds at 175 miles per hour. Within another 24 hours, it kind of escalates to her category 4. I mean, this is a very strong storm. On July 1st and 2nd, it hits the Karaku Island. I hope I said that right. I probably did not. Devastating it, as well as it intensifies to a category 5 and just damages 95% of the buildings in Grenada, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. I mean, massive destruction there if you've seen those images. On July 5th, it kind of weakens to a category 2. It hits the Yucatan Peninsula. There is where it hit some dry air and it really kind of de-escalated and weakened. But at the same time, Houston was always in what they call the cone of uncertainty. And so Houston should have been preparing. On the 7th and 8th, it makes landfall on the Texas coast near Matagorda as a category 1. However, as it was hitting land, it was actually intensifying as that dry air had disappeared. And so I think that's what a lot of people didn't understand. It wasn't like a category 1 that was hitting and de-intensifying. It was actually intensifying as it hit landfall. And so it was a shock, the fact that the storm hung around for so long and even hit north of I-10, intense wind gusts. And guys, I would really encourage you to watch Travis's videos to see some of that footage. And so, we've heard, and I've had a lot of the people I know in Florida say to me, "Oh, we hear this every year." But I honestly think that this year may be different. We'll track, we'll see if, in fact, there was too much hype around this year. But the Climate Prediction Center has a forecast of above normal hurricane season, expecting 17 to 25 total named storms. And guys, why this is so concerning to us, why we're talking about it here, is that we all know that we have an insurance crisis in the United States. Home insurance has just risen exponentially, especially in Florida, resulting in states having to take private reserve funds, or I'm sorry, do provide insurance to citizens because private carriers have left the state. So if you look down in Florida, Citizens Insurance, that is, kind of the public insurance company that so many people have had to use because they can't get insurance otherwise. In California, they have the Fire Fair Plan. And so many folks are very nervous about this year because the reserves could be, will run dry in places like Florida if there is a big hurricane. And so there's a lot of concern out there, especially, in terms of what is that going to do with insurance rates that have already, been raised exponentially. And so part of the reason that this is changing, like I mentioned, is we're going from an El Nino to a La Nina. And I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right. But this is a change in weather patterns that many people think are going to cause more storms. But let's move from what happened and to the timeline to the response. And so here are our politicians. You've got Greg Abbott was in South Korea, and Ted Cruz was doing some whale watching in South Carolina while all this was going down. And guys, again, it could be that they really didn't think this was going to be a big deal. Maybe, because they thought it was disinformation. Maybe because weather has become so politically divisive, we can't even accept what's really happening. So then here, Jack, we can play the clip. So this is the mayor responding. And what I want everyone to listen here is this is where the blame and shame has started. If we can play that clip.
And folks, before we play the clip, just check your audio here. I believe the volume is a little low for this clip, so you may have to adjust it, and then it'll get loud again when the clip is over.
This team is doing everything we can to put pressure on CenterPoint, do a better job. I don't know what everyone was doing this morning at 7 a.m. I was talking to the CEO of CenterPoint, letting him know they must do better. They must communicate better. So yes, we're going to hold CenterPoint accountable after we do an action review. But right now, the focus is get the lights on. And we're going to continue to monitor this, speak for Houstonians, and let everyone know that the lights are our highest priority.
All right. So I don't know if you guys noticed, but in that clip, he says center point probably 3 or 4 times. And so that's the mayor. And I believe, that is kind of the beginning of the campaign of blame and shame here. But who is Centerpoint? This is the energy provider. And so this guy, Joseph Tran, has taken to Twitter. He's running for the Texas State Senate. He's a Republican. So always take that with a grain of salt. But I do think his perspective is very interesting. He actually claims that he went out in the field and was talking to hundreds of linemen. And basically, the linemen could not believe what was happening. They were sitting idle. And this is what reminds me of Katrina, because if you guys remember, for those of you that are around for Katrina, we heard about, I saw it. I was actually in Memphis, Tennessee. You could see on I-55 going south, it was just power trucks, ambulances, fire trucks. There was nothing coming up 55 north the days after Katrina. But yet, none of that reached those people. And so similarly, what you're hearing is that the linemen are sitting idle because Centerpoint has a ticketing system. And guys, this is where I want you to think about how this sort of feeds into operational efficiency, cutting costs. I bet you anything that ticketing system, and I'm just making an assumption right now we can validate, but it's probably being offshored. There's probably an offshore call center handling that ticket center. But what's happening is that what linemen used to do is they just go down the power line and they would fix as they go. But what's happening here is that they're sitting there idle, waiting for Centerpoint to assign them to a ticket. And so they're not getting out there. They're not fixing the power issue. And as Jack said, I said 800,000. He probably checked a few seconds before we went live, and it's now at 680,000. But that's still so many people without power in Houston, guys. And, if you don't, as Travis's video shows you, without, you don't have AC. And I think this is what's most concerning, is that these folks don't have air conditioning. It's very hot in Texas. And what you have is an absolute debacle with a response from Centerpoint Energy. And what, I was actually talking about this with Julius. And what we know, for those of you that have been through storms like this, is that we're not even seeing the half of it yet. We're not going to really understand what's going on for several weeks. We are still in the fog of war, and no one really wants us to know how bad it's probably getting out there. I've also heard, that there's been selective turning on power. Won't get into that today, but I think it also matters where you're living in Houston, as to whether your power has been turned on. And then this brings us to, this guy is getting roasted on social media, as he probably should. 7 million salary. What's funny about this statement is he's just made a statement about how, trying to keep you need to help everybody out and keep your thermostat at 76 degrees because we don't want to strain the power grid, while he's sitting next to a thermostat that says 70 degrees. And so this guy, Joseph Trayan, is taking him to the mat in social media. It's kind of interesting. But you see here, Houstonians are sleeping in cars, selling valuables to survive power outages after Hurricane Beryl. So this is probably much worse than we actually think. So the hope is that everyone's going to have electricity by Sunday. And I pray that that's actually what happens, because it's going to be very, very hot in Houston. And so, guys, this is the United States of America. We are a first world country. This is not, we all talked about how bad the response was to Katrina when that happened. This is not what should be happening right now. And I think our buddy Travis could attest to that as well. And let me just see, I can't remember. Okay. And then our friend, the CEO of Cinder Point, has taken to social media to, kind of defend himself with a good feel good video. However, I don't think anybody in Houston is feeling good right now. Back to you, Jack.
So a couple of things come to mind here, Melody, when I think about this. First of all, Texas is pretty unique. Texas, the ERCOT grid, they have their own power grid in Texas, and it's separate from the other states. There are very few interconnections with other states. So when there are problems in the Texas power grid, it's not like where I'm at in the Northeast, where I'm in the PJM grid is where I run. If there's not enough juice in our grid, we have a lot of interconnections with neighboring states that you could very easily divert power from other places. Texas is kind of siloed like that. And since the big freeze in 2021, there's been a lot of energy around the Texas power grid and the sustainability of it. Sometimes they say, hey, it's a shining example of how Texas is special. And then other times, like now, or like that deep freeze, not so much. So you're probably going to hear if this story continues, you're probably going to hear a lot about that. I would also caution against the politics of storms. We're already seeing that a little bit. We all saw, Hurricane Katrina became a very politicized topic. Hurricane Sandy became a little bit politicized. The famous hug between Chris Christie and his disgusting fleece and Barack Obama when he got off the plane. That was very politicized also. The thing about the governor being out of state, that all politics aside, that's a head shaking moment. When you are the governor, you are the general of emergency preparedness in your state because you have the National Guard at your fingertips. You are the one with the direct line to all the federal agencies. So, the thing about Ted Cruz being out of state and the Ted Cruz indicator, I can see the politics of that, but Ted Cruz doesn't have resources at his disposal. All he can do is make silly speeches in front of cameras. The governor absolutely can. So the governor not being in state when a hurricane makes landfall, in my opinion, is inexcusable. And that's not to be political. That's just like, hey, do your job. All right. And that is a real head shaker of a moment for me. And the other thing I would say is I've worked in power grid. I worked in nuclear power for 15 years. I've been on storm prep and storm response before. It's a big deal in energy and in energy infrastructure. I slept in a conference room for Hurricane Irene at the power plant, just in case there was an event at the plant related to the storm. We had to pre-stage, and it was a week before my wedding. I had a lot to do when Hurricane Irene made landfall and preparation to make, and yet I had to put all that on pause and sleep in a conference room just in case the plant had an accident. It didn't. We were actually the first plant to come back up. So the thing here with CenterPoint Energy, I guess the point I'm making is storm response is one of your core functions as a grid operator. And everybody that works for that utility should have been ready to rock. You should have been, should have had people in place before the storm was hit, ready to go. And then the last thing I would say, with all of these guys coming from out of state and the linesmen coming in to help and everything, that's chaos when you try to do that. I mean, we had, after Hurricane Sandy, we had some of the outbuildings outside of our security perimeter at the nuclear plant was used as the staging area for some of these out-of-state linemen. And when those guys all came in, hundreds of them, it was chaos. We had parts and supplies started disappearing out of warehouses and things like that. I mean, those guys were stealing anything that wasn't bolted down. We were having trouble. Like, we needed to drive around the facility and the guys would just stand in the road with their coffee. And, you're trying to get through and they don't move. They just sit there and stand there. These are the kind of guys who are like, well, if I move slow, the overtime racks up. And so I could tell you this, you get union issues start to play a role, and you get the people from the local grid start to get defensive. No, that's my job, not your job. We saw that in Puerto Rico also, the hoarding of parts. And so you get a lot of siloed interests, and not just presidential and senatorial politics, but petty little business politics gets in play here. And it really needs strong leadership to make it work. And it just apparently at the state company and local grid level, we're just not getting that in Houston. This was a Category 1 storm. It wasn't one of those big boomers. It was no Katrina or Andrew. This is really inexcusable. And I'm going to step down from my soapbox now.
Yeah, just one little stat I'd like to mention. So I agree, Jack, these things always become so chaotic, and there are so many vested interests, so many different groups there that have to coordinate together. But what I found very interesting is what some of the linemen said is that typically in a storm like this, they work 100 tickets a day. They aren't even getting 2 or 3 tickets. And so I think this, to me, guys, I've worked in technology. I've worked on the back end of operations, and I can bet you some money that call center, that they probably offshored it to save money, and or have an offshore type ticketing system that just completely broke down. Because in a time of chaos, like you say, Jack, you do need that leadership, and it's not going to be some 20-year-old Indian guy with a bachelor's degree that's going to be able to figure it out, when most of the time they don't know where, that Los Angeles and San Francisco are so far apart. For instance, they don't know our geography. I mean, can you imagine that your command center would be run by, something like that during some, an event this big? And so agree with you in terms of the intensity, but just like with Katrina, I think the response can sometimes make the event worse than it would have been. And so, praying for our friends in Houston, hoping everyone gets power. It's the most vulnerable that I worry about, because they are not the ones that you're typically going to hear about on social media.
Yeah. And, the last thing I would add is, again, when, drawing on my nuclear background, when I worked in nuclear power, we had regular drills to this effect, dealing with prolonged power outages, dealing with various emergency scenarios that might develop at the plant. We drilled for this. And so when it came time, we had people whose job it was to coordinate it outside the company resources, people who knew the phone number to call at the state and at the federal level, and, at FEMA, knew these people by name, interacted with them, knew who they were, knew who their families were, because we drilled so regularly. And a lot of power grids, at least in the Northeast, the grid operators do this also. And so to see this kind of chaos in Texas, whoever's job it is over at Centerpoint to be coordinating these outside resources that are coming in is just asleep at the wheel. These guys are there and they're ready to work, and nobody's telling them what to do. Monday morning, everybody's a quarterback, but you definitely have a really just a failure of coordination, of prep, of drilling. You want to get this stuff done to the point where it's muscle memory when it actually happens, not the panic now, figure out what do we do. So really disappointing response in Texas here. And it's 2024. We've all been through failed storm responses, and you'd think we'd be better at this by now, but apparently not.
Absolutely.
All right, guys. Yeah, thank you very much, Melody, for that report and that excellent background information. And we're going to move on to our next topic. And this is one from last week. Let me just say, I got a lot of feedback from people, mostly good, some bad. It was an emotionally charged subject when we talked about Steward Healthcare last week. All right. I mean, this is absolutely a topic that gets people's blood pressure up. I'm right there with you. Everybody recognizes there are problems. There are differing opinions on how to go about it. And that's a healthy discussion to be had, and I encourage it. We had a lot of people say, please don't lose track of this story. Stay on top of it, which we absolutely will. And as that discussion was going on, we actually had more developments came in. Let me just give a quick recap of what happened with Steward for those who didn't see the segment last week. And I've put a link down in the description below. If you want to go back and check that out after the stream, you can. Steward Healthcare filed for bankruptcy this year. They are one of the largest hospital operators in the United States. They own dozens of hospitals throughout the country. They have been bleeding those hospitals dry, paying themselves hundreds of millions of dollars in dividends while these hospitals have been going belly up. The hospitals' contractors and vendors have not been paid, leading to equipment being repossessed, and that has actually led to the death of patients. Now this company is also embroiled in a scandal overseas in Malta, where they did essentially the same thing. And then last week, when we were covering this story, we talked about how even though this company did not have money to pay for their bills, to pay for their doctors, they did have $7 million to hire former British military guys to spy on the short sellers and the regulators that were circling around the company, doing things like recording people in their homes, following them when they dropped off their children at schools, manufacturing fake financial and bank statements to try to make it look like the people investigating them were corrupt. So these guys are the full Monty. And well, we have got a big update on the Steward Healthcare story. And this one comes from CBS News on July 11th, which was that Thursday? That was Thursday this week. Steward Healthcare now under federal investigation for fraud and corruption. And this is U.S. federal investigation. CBS News has learned federal authorities in Boston have opened a criminal investigation into Steward Healthcare, a company that owns dozens of hospitals nationwide, including 9 in Massachusetts, according to 2 people familiar with the matter. Steward, which is based in Dallas, recently filed for bankruptcy. Federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston are investigating Steward Healthcare based on various allegations, including fraud and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, 2 people familiar with the matter said. And that's key there, that they're being investigated based on, number 1, fraud. That's implying domestic fraud. But number 2, violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So Steward is being investigated by authorities in Malta, and I'm sure they're going to be investigated in the UK for that spying story. But now you've got U.S. law enforcement at the DOJ is going after them under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So all these things that they're doing in Europe, they're going to face accountability for it here in the United States. That law prohibits U.S. citizens and entities from engaging in corrupt activities when operating overseas. In addition to its U.S. properties, Steward was tapped by the government in Malta to run 3 state-owned hospitals. That deal is now at the center of a criminal corruption probe playing out in the island nation. Neither Steward nor its executives have been charged in connection with the matter in Malta. I would add the word yet there because they almost certainly will. The Department of Justice didn't immediately respond to a request for comment, and neither would Steward. Steward filed for bankruptcy reorganization in May and is exploring plans to sell all of its hospitals. Bids for the Massachusetts facilities, which have remained open during the bankruptcy, are due on Monday. Senator Ed Markey, a Democrat from Massachusetts, issued a statement Thursday calling Steward just the latest example of corporate greed endangering our healthcare system. Steward must be investigated, and I hope the company and the corporate executives who facilitated Steward's actions face consequences that reflect the lives, livelihoods, safety, and security that they stole from our communities. So Steward Healthcare back in the news this week. They are actually being investigated by federal authorities here in the States, in addition to the authorities in Malta, and it's under that Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. That's interesting. So it pertains to what they were doing there. So guys, we're going to stay on top of this story as it develops. This is a new development that the DOJ is now looking into them on top of the bankruptcy. And I am sure we are going to hear more about this story as time goes on. And
Jack,
go ahead, man.
Sorry, we had a couple of questions from the chat, if you don't mind, for you.
Absolutely.
I can't highlight them, but I'll just say them too, if you don't mind.
Yep.
So the first question is, will anyone go to jail? Will they really go to jail?
Okay, let me see if I can find the comment here. First of all, will anyone go to jail? I'm guessing yes. I have a hard time believing nobody's going to go to jail just because it's so high profile and so disgusting. And these people are living so high off of this, right? I mean, I showed the picture last week of Ralph De La Torre's yacht and this $40 million boat that has more square footage than the average house, several times the square footage of the average house. These guys have paid themselves so much money. And, you know, this other company, Medical Properties Trust, that is associated with them. Let me tell you, after I shared the story we did last week about Medical Properties Trust, I had these absolute clowns on Twitter start bombarding my account. And I went and I looked at these accounts, and they're all new accounts. They're only like a year old. And the only thing they ever tweet about is Medical Properties Trust and Steward Healthcare. They're anonymous accounts. They don't have names. They don't have faces. And all they do is make comments about Medical Properties Trust. These guys are paid shills. I can tell you the people at Steward Healthcare, I'm going to give my opinion here, right? These are just some of the biggest dirtbags I've ever encountered in my work since I started doing financial YouTube. And that is a bold statement because I've encountered some pretty amazing dirtbags in my time investigating some of the frauds I've investigated. But what these guys are doing, and the fact that Ralph De La Torre, the CEO, is a doctor who took the Hippocratic Oath on top of that, and now his actions are leading to the death of patients, indefensible. Does that rise to the level of criminality? I'm not a lawyer, but I am sure financial crimes will be identified, especially as Steward has been going bankrupt. They haven't been paying their rent to Medical Properties Trust, and Medical Properties Trust has just been, as they go behind on their rent, just been making promissory notes and making loans back to Steward Healthcare to make them appear to be solvent, blurring the lines between the two companies. I think when the smoke settles from this story, I think it's going to be more than a few people in handcuffs on trial for what's going on at this story, and rightly so.
Thank you, Jack.
I never did find that comment. I don't know who that was. Will anyone go to jail? But that was a good question.
Will anybody go to prison? And it was Deborah. I don't know how to say the last name. I put it in the private chat. Okay. And then the second question comes from Raymond, and this is why is my deductible $5,000 for a single male, 35 years old, and monthly cost still $400?
Well, Raymond, we're going to get a little bit more into insurance here. There's the comment there. $5,000 for a single male, 35 years old, and a monthly cost still $400. So, I mean, really, you're talking like, this is pretty much everything you're going to be out of pocket for, right? I mean, this is just like catastrophic insurance only, and still paying $400 a month. Look, I don't have all the answers to healthcare, guys. It's a charged subject. And like I mentioned earlier, I think the socialists are circling like buzzards around this story. People like Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey, trying to capitalize on this for the government to take over healthcare and make it free for everybody. And, as we are learning with college and with healthcare and student loans, if you want to make something outrageously expensive, go ahead and make it free. All right. That's what I have learned. The easiest way to make something unaffordable is to make it free, because there is no such thing as free. If it's dependent on the work, the services, or the products of others, there is a cost associated with it. And, unless we're going to make the medical profession slaves of the state who need to provide their services against their will, essentially for whatever price we give them, then you have to admit that there is going to be a profit factor in healthcare. Doctors study very hard. They're very smart people. It's very hard to become a doctor. They're entitled to being generously compensated for the value that they provide. But at the same time, guys like Ralph De La Torre, who are adding no value, making no innovation, treating no patients, just vampires sucking the life out of the healthcare system. We have to figure out a way to protect the integrity of the healthcare system from those vampires. And I don't have the answer to that, guys, but I can tell you medical socialism will only make that worse. I guarantee you that. If you want to make it more expensive, go ahead and make it free. And we got another story about healthcare coming up later in the show, and it's going to have you shaking your head, guys. But there's some charts and things. Look at the stock prices of the insurers. Look at the profit margins of the insurers. All right. While your healthcare is getting so much more expensive, and while arguably the quality of your treatment is getting worse and worse, their profit margins keep going up and up. So something is fundamentally broken in that system. Thank you, Raymond. I appreciate the question, sir. And I think that was pretty much all I have for this segment. Melody, did you have anything you want to add to this?
No, I just appreciate the follow, Jack. I think these are really important stories, and I think we're going to continue to see more and more about this, and we'll follow it all the way through, and hopefully we will see people go to prison, because it is, unconscionable.
And I would add the importance of people being prosecuted and not just writing checks and paying fines. There has to be a deterrent in this, right? I mean, the next guy, if all we do is slap them on a wrist and the fine is a few $1 million, then there's nothing stopping the next guy from doing it. So, prosecutors, DOJ, don't slow walk this one. I can tell you that. This is way too important, and this affects way too many people. All right. And
thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Melody. And that's going to do it for this one. And now we are going to pass this one back on to Melody. Melody, what are we talking about now? Is this is the Japan story, isn't it?
Yes. A lot of conjecture about whether Japan intervened last week in the markets to support its currency. And so, as is usual, I'm going to get the paint dry story because this is a really important foundation, guys, for people to understand. A lot of times, especially when we talk about things like housing, we're looking at home prices in the United States. We're talking about the Fed, but in reality, there's so much on a macro and global level that could really impact the housing industry, impact our markets. And that's why we want to talk about Japan. I want to do some defining of terms, help you understand what's happening there, and also understand how that could be very impactful to our markets here. And so let me share my screen again real quick here. And we'll
I'm
get
going to try
started.
not to bumble this screen share, Melody. I'm gonna nail this one.
Yeah, I think you'll get it, Jack.
Nailed
Okay,
it.
so excellent. All right. The first thing that everybody needs to understand, our markets in the United States, we have a lot of help from our friends across the globe. And, Japan is our largest holder of United States Treasury securities. This is as of April 2024, but I can tell you nothing material has happened since then. They are the largest holder. And, this could be very detrimental if Japan decided that they were not able for some reason or some reason or other to participate in our treasury markets. And so I just want everyone to keep that as the backdrop of what I'm going to talk to you about. Additionally, I want to say that the 10-year treasury, more than anything else, honestly, in the financial markets, really is important to watch if you're watching housing, for instance. And really, it is what most people in financial services watch because it definitely is impactful in terms of what rates that are going to be lent out there, and what you can do. Because, guys, in our hyper financialized world, a lot of times it's not about selling goods or services. It's not about providing services. It's about what percentage can I get on my carry? Like, what can I make something? Can I borrow at a low percentage and make a little bit more than what I'm borrowing? And that's called my cost of funds. And many companies live on their cost of funds only, meaning that they're not profitable. The only way they are profitable is through these types of arrangements or hedging around interest rates. And so this is kind of an important foundation to understand. And so let's move to the currency wars right now. What's going on with Japan? And so essentially, you can see that as rates rose in the United States, that the Japanese yen, that's their currency, has fallen sharply against the dollar. Ed Chancellor did an article in May. He wrote a great book called The Price of Time, and it's all about the history of interest rates. And honestly, guys, it's really one of the better reads that I did this year, and it goes all the way back to biblical times before we could even write on tablets. We were scratching interest rates on the cave walls, and so I think it's an excellent book. But anyway, he wrote an article back in May. And he was talking about the large numbers of tourists that were going over to Japan because essentially you could get a Big Mac in Japan for 47% less of what you were paying in the United States. But as the Fed raised interest rates here, the yen has fallen in value, which has precipitated, the powers that be in Japan to intervene in their markets. And people are conjecturing that that is what happened last week. And, one where this gets really important, again, I'll talk about hyperfinancialization and how all of this is interconnected. Believe it or not, some people say that, I know that we talk about the GFC as subprime, but in reality, there was a big carry trade that was happening around the Japanese yen, and some point to that as what could have potentially caused problems at Lehman. And so this world we live in is way more complicated than just originating subprime loans. That's not what took down the global financial system. That was a component. People were using those subprime loans as collateral to borrow other things or as collateral to certain trades like the carry trade. So what's happening right now is essentially people think that the Japanese intervened for the third time this year to save their currency. And if they need to save their currency, that means probably less ability to participate in our treasury market. And so this is kind of the conundrum that is occurring there. So, if you look at essentially what happened over the past week, you can look at why people think there was an intervention. Things were spiraling out of control, and then it dropped here, and so we don't know exactly for sure, but we'll probably find out in the next few weeks what actually happened. And so what I want to go to now, just talk about what the carry trade is, because that sounds kind of complicated. What people do is, and this is one of the hottest macro assets, is they borrow in the Japanese currency because there's such a low interest rate there, and then they go and buy dollars and earn more than 5%, and that is the carry trade. There's all kinds of trades like that across the financial markets. I remember, back during my time, we often use FX or currency to hedge our available for sale securities, our gain on sale pipelines and mortgage. And so all of these things are very much interconnected. And what's driving this is what's driven so many people over the last decade is a search for yield. Everybody is looking for that yield. And these trades could have given up to 18% of yield. And so when you have people gambling in the market, it can have massive consequences. And so one consequence here, guys, is if for some reason Japan cannot participate in our treasury market at the same level that it does, that could mean higher 10-year rate. And what that means then is it doesn't matter what the Fed is doing to some degree. That means that mortgage rates will remain high. And so a lot of people are talking about the Fed as the only reason that perhaps rates can go down. Well, it's important to realize what they can impact and what they can't. And if this 10-year stays at these higher yields that we've been seeing, although we have definitely seen, and a lot of people point to the Japanese intervention, we definitely saw that 10-year drop over the last few days of last week, and a big move there. But if for some reason they are not able to keep up that intervention without impacting their participation in our treasury market, we could see the 10-year stay high, and it won't matter so much exactly what the Fed is doing. And so again, I know this is all a bit complicated, but if you walk away with nothing else, you want to walk away with the fact that essentially, our financial system is just a big casino. And you can go and you can look at, there's all kinds of studies you can look at the carry trade between the Japanese yen and the AU, the Australian currency, and how that tracks certain ETFs. And so as much as we all think we're all geniuses and can figure out the stock market, these are some of the reasons that we cannot. There are just so much happening in these markets, so much grift, so much, reaching for yield, so much over leverage, so much rehypothecation. One of these trades, the Japanese Widowmaker, you might have heard about. This is where people were essentially trying to short the Japanese bonds for decades, because a lot of people believed, again, that a lot of that money would come back, would have to come back into Japan from the US. And you remember that chart I showed you at the beginning. And so, the big question now is, will the BOJ raise interest rates in July to impact this carry trade? Well, a lot of people believe that even if they do raise interest rates, it won't be enough to really keep out the speculation in this market. And so in reality, what's happening is that the Japanese are in this tough spot where they're battling against this carry trade to keep their currency at a specific level. And they're really having issues and under pressure as the Fed rates remain high as well. And so, this is an important story, in my opinion, because I think a lot of time we're looking, domestically to try to understand what's happening in the stock market, what's happening in the economy. But these stories have a massive impact on what's actually happening here. And so, Jack, any questions from you of
Melody, I could go on this topic for an hour if you let me. Don't let me. But
okay.
first of all, like you got to paint the picture here, because unless people live in the financial space, they're not really going to appreciate the situation in Japan, right? We had one of the most aggressive interest rate hiking cycles the world has ever seen here in the States over the last few years to fight this inflation. We raised our rate from effectively nothing to 5.25%. And we did it in a span of a little over a year. And of course, that's caused massive dislocations in the economy. Japan, who has some of the most dovish or ridiculous amount of money printing policy in the world, has raised their interest rates. They finally had their first interest rate hike this year, a few months ago. They raised their interest rates from negative 0.1 to nothing, which made me say, whoa, Kazuo Ueda, head of the Bank of Japan, you party animal, you. Like, hey, take it slow, buddy. What's the rush? From negative 0.1 to 0. That was their big interest rate hike. All right. Now, so if you're a Japanese bank, you can't make any interest in Japanese government bonds. There's just no interest to be made, which is what's causing this yen carry trade. You got to take your yen, you got to go to the States and buy U.S. government bonds to get some yield. And in between those two things, you have to sell your yen and first buy dollars, which is why the yen keeps falling. All right. So, and because you can borrow yen for essentially nothing, the banks keep loaning yen into existence, increasing the number of yen in circulation, causing its value to decline. Now, why should you care here in the States? I want to bring up this little image here. This is one of my favorite little images. If you want to really understand interest rates in the bond market, guys, understand the relationship between bond prices and interest rates. When people start buying up bonds and driving the prices higher, it sends interest rates lower. And when people start dumping bonds, it sends those bond prices lower and those interest rates higher. That's an important, remember that seesaw. Because what's going on right now, first of all, you got to wonder, where is Japan getting the dollars from? All right, that's so important because Japan dumped, speculating now, $22 billion this month, or just on the other day, to try to strengthen the yen. And they did another $60 billion a few weeks ago. That's $82 billion that Japan has dumped in order to buy their own yen. Where did they get that from? If they got that from their $1.1 trillion stash of U.S. Treasury bonds, well, they would have been selling those Treasury bonds. Again, the seesaw, that would have sent those prices lower and those interest rates higher on those Treasury bonds. But that's not what we saw. We actually saw interest rates fall during this time. So Japan is not getting their dollars from selling their government bonds. And Janet Yellen doesn't want them to do that. Not during an election year. Higher interest rates is bad for jobs and bad for the economy. So where else could they get those dollars from? Well, the only place I can think of is the Federal Reserve and currency swaps. That you should care about, because what happens with a Forex swap is the Japanese central bank prints yen, and then the U.S. Federal Reserve prints dollars, and this happens off balance sheet. So you cannot see it. It's off balance sheet debt. They don't report this stuff. And then they swap their printed yen for their printed dollars. And because it's net neutral, doesn't affect any of the Fed's balance sheet or anything like that. Now the Bank of Japan has dollars, and they go dump those dollars in the open market. Now those printed dollars are circulating, lowering the value of the dollar against the yen. In other words, it's very possible that the United States ends up bailing out Japan here. If we are printing dollars and trading them with Japan and they're dumping them into the open market, then the number of dollars in circulation is increasing, which means inflation of the dollar is getting worse and the pain that you're feeling at home is getting worse. And you're doing it to bail out Japanese banks. That is very, very important. And you need to know that's going on. And most people don't understand the seesaw and they don't understand the bond markets. And so it's very easy to make them not care. This is a snooze fest of a story, but it does affect your bottom line. And we also saw stories recently, again, rein me in, Mel, if I'm going too much here, stop.
Well, I was going to stop and just say, we do know which of the Japanese banks was just granted access or for
Norinchukin.
Norinchukin. Yeah. So if you want to go, if you were going there, I think that's important.
Yep. Norinchukin is a Japanese bank that recently announced that they made a bad bet on U.S. Treasury bonds, and that they're losing money. And so they're going to sell those U.S. Treasury bonds. Recall that effect, all right? So they're going to send interest rates higher on Treasury bonds, and they're going to pile into something called CLOs, collateralized loan obligations. And when you hear CLO, I need you to think dog poop, just like in The Big Short, all right? What it is you take all of these loans from people who probably can't pay it back, zombie companies that don't make money, commercial real estate debt that's going belly up left and right here in the States. And you take all this debt nobody wants to buy, and if you put enough of it inside a bucket, you can call it a CLO, and you can find a ratings agency that's going to stamp that thing AAA rated. It's still a bucket of dog poop, but somehow it's a better smelling investment if you put enough of it in the bucket. And so Norinchukin Bank said, we're getting out of our U.S. Treasuries and we're getting into CLOs, which is like out of the frying pan into the fire of debt risk. And what's happening as Japanese banks are being driven to take more risk because they're chasing yield that they can't get. They can't get interest rates on their own government bonds because the BOJ has them held at nothing. They're transferring into very risky business debt, CLOs. And we're seeing, again, recall the seesaw. I'm sorry to keep flashing this, but the opposite of this seesaw, right? They're bidding up these risky bonds, so they're sending the bond end, the prices end higher, and they're sending the interest rates on that junk debt lower. And we're actually seeing the spreads between safe investments like government bonds and garbage investments like CLOs. The spreads are starting to narrow as Japanese banks dump those sovereign bonds, sending their interest rates higher, and buy CLOs, sending their interest rates lower, which is creating a big dislocation in the bond market where investors are not being compensated for the risk they're taking in these very risky investments. That's going to affect banks, insurance companies. It's going to affect your money markets. It's going to affect everything up to and including the interest rates on mortgages and car loans. So it's very easy to fall asleep with stories like Japanese banks are chasing yield and the yen carry trade because it's not a very exciting topic. But man, does this affect you? And this is the third largest economy in the world we're talking about. This is going to cause big problems, and it's definitely a story worth following. And you nailed it, Melody. Thank you so much for keeping up with this story.
Yep. And I just want to repeat, thank you, Jack. It is boring, but guys, if you go back and research around Lehman and what the carry trades had to do with that implosion, I would recommend it because that's why these are so important. I think the cliff notes of the GFC that we all learned in The Big Short, as much as I love that movie, I'll always love that movie. I think it has done a great disservice to many because it did not go into the complexity of what really happened there. And I just, a fan of Michael Lewis or was a big fan until probably the FTX book.
Before FTX, yeah.
Yeah. And but I think though that means that I have to go and look back at his other work through a different lens, right? Once I saw what he did with FTX, I had to go back and look. And, so some of the things that I just kind of forgave The Big Short about, I think in some ways they've become these cliff notes that have really done a disservice to everyone's understanding of the financial markets and in many ways have made people incapable of seeing what is coming right now. And so I'll just finish with that. That's why the story is important, as boring as it is. But Jack, thank you for that color. I mean, that was absolutely fantastic to help flush this out. I'm always scared of spending too much time because it is so boring, but that was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, it's important. It is very important. It's not very exciting material, but it really does affect people. And I think that's one of the reasons why the crooks of the world are able to get away with so much is because they're able to put people to sleep with what's really going on. And so people don't pay attention. It's one of the things The Big Short did do very well. I mean, they used Margot Robbie in a bathtub to tell the story, right, or Chef Bourdain, or some of the literary devices they used to capture people's interest on a very dull topic. And you're right, it wasn't perfect. And, the FTX thing made me wave bye-bye to Michael Lewis as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. I want to say real quick, thank you, Ham Sandwich, for the super chat and the support of our channel. Thank you very much. And Ham Sandwich is also saying, I think there should be more likes. And I agree, Ham Sandwich, shameless self-promotion. There should be more likes. And I think Hammy Sammy was saying something else here. Did I miss another one? No, I think that was all of it. But thank you so much, Ham Sandwich. I appreciate that. Like the name, by the way.
Me too.
let me see if I can take this down. And was there anything else I wanted to? Oh, somebody was asking about my Yellen voice. And well, let me just say, Janet Yellen is over there in D.C. right now on the phone with Jerome Powell saying, "Hello, Jerome, it's your ex Janet calling. And I just want you to know that I'm going to need you to go ahead and print some dollars and make them available to Japan, because it's really going to hurt my job prospects if the Japanese start dumping our debt, driving my interest rates higher during an election year. And you've seen that guy on TV talking about Vice President Trump and President Putin of Ukraine. I could really use all the help I could get here." And so, yeah, there's my Yellen dance monkey dance. I get that all the time on my channel. People really want me to do my Janet. So
Amazing.
Janet Yellen is definitely watching very closely, because what happens in Japan could affect the borrowing costs of the United States. And you guys may have noticed we got something of a little bit of a borrowing problem here stateside. And Japan is the biggest holder of U.S. government debt in the world, outside of the Federal Reserve, of course, at $1.1 trillion, more so than China. It's a very common misconception that we owe all this money to China. We actually owe considerably more to Japan. Awesome job. All right. We're going to wrap up with the Japan story. Awesome job, Melody. Thank you so much. And guys, I just want to say it's time to put your mouth guards back in. All right. Because this is another one of those stories that's going to make you want to grind your teeth, grind your gears, throw something. So find something soft and find a place that isn't a window to throw it at as you feel compelled to take out your anger as we go through this story, because we've got another one with the grift in the healthcare industry. My hat, I got to tip my tinfoil hat to Melody for sending this story to me this week after following up on the Steward story. She saw this one as soon as it came out. This was in the Wall Street Journal. I think this was on Tuesday. Insurers pocketed $50 billion from Medicare for diseases no doctor treated. All right. Now, let me just preface this whole story with an anecdote. I've been struggling with a back injury for about the last year. I haven't been able to go on many fire calls recently because I got a bulging disc. And every time I try to see a doctor or get some kind of scan or some kind of test, I've got to hack my way through bureaucrats before I can even talk to a care provider. And then they're like, "Oh, no, you need a pre-authorization and it's got to be in network and you got to fax it. And who uses a fax machine anymore?" But that's what I've been going through, trying to get treatment for my back injury. And then I see this story when there's government cash up for grabs. Look at how the song they sing changes. This story is really going to get to you guys. All right. We're talking about United Healthcare here. One of the single largest component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, UNH. United Health. This isn't some slouch company you've never heard of. This is the big dog of medicine. Questionable diagnosis of HIV and other maladies triggered extra Medicare Advantage payments. It's anatomically impossible. You gotta love these guys. Gloria Lee was perplexed when the phone call started coming in from a representative of her Medicare insurer. Could a nurse stop by her Boston home to give her a quick checkup? It was a helpful perk, no cost. In fact, she'd get a $50 gift card. After several such calls in 2022, Lee agreed. A nurse showed up, checked her over, asked her questions, and then diagnosed her with diabetic cataracts. Now, remember the story I just told you about my back, guys, right? You call them, and they're like, no, we're not paying for anything, this and that, out of network, all the excuses. This lady was cold called out of the blue by her insurer, and they said, "We want to send somebody to you to check you out." And they bribed her with a $50 gift card to make that happen. What is going on? Why all of a sudden is this insurer so interested in somebody seeing Gloria Lee? The finding was good news for Lee's insurer, a unit of United Health Group, UNH. Medicare pays insurers more for sicker patients. In the case of someone like Lee with diabetic cataracts, up to $2,700 more a year at that time. Medicare has created an incentive. And there's a very famous quote from Charlie Munger, who is, what's his name? Warren Buffett's famous number 2 guy. Charlie Munger has a famous quote: "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." Well, there is an incentive in Medicare Advantage for insurers to cover patients with diabetic cataracts. They make an extra $2,700 a year from a patient who's diagnosed with diabetic cataracts than one who isn't. And wouldn't you know it, turns out a lot of people are coming down with diabetic cataracts all of a sudden. The retired accountant doesn't have diabetes, her own doctor later said, let alone the cloudy vision sometimes caused by the disease. Private insurers involved in the government's Medicare Advantage program made hundreds of thousands of questionable diagnoses that triggered extra taxpayer-funded payments from 2018 to 2021, including outright wrong ones like Lee's, a Wall Street Journal analysis of billions of Medicare records found. The questionable diagnoses include some for potentially deadly illnesses such as AIDS, for which patients received no subsequent care, and for conditions people couldn't possibly have, the analysis showed. Often neither patients nor their doctors had any idea. They call you out of the blue. They bribe you with a gift card. They come to your house. They diagnose you with AIDS, and they don't even tell you or your doctor so they can get more money from Uncle Sam. Medicare Advantage, the $450 billion a year system in which private insurers oversee Medicare benefits, grew out of the idea that private sector could provide healthcare more economically. It has swelled over the last 2 decades to cover more than half of the 67 million seniors and disabled people on Medicare. It's important to note, guys, Medicare Advantage is very popular among Medicare recipients. More than half of them are on this. Instead of saving taxpayers money, though, Medicare Advantage has added tens of billions of dollars in costs. Researchers and some government officials have said one reason is that insurers can add diagnoses to ones that patients' own doctors submit. Medicare gave insurers that option so that they could catch conditions that doctors neglected to record. The journal's analysis, however, found many diagnoses were added for which patients received no treatment or that contradicted their own doctor's views. So you've got insurance companies diagnosing with people with diseases, not even telling their doctors because they have a financial incentive to do so. Now, here's this guy on screen. This is Dr. Howard Chen. I'm going to talk about him. Dr. Howard Chen found some interesting information. The insurers make new diagnoses after reviewing medical charts, sometimes using artificial intelligence, oh yay, there's AI, and sending nurses to visit patients in their homes. They pay doctors for access to patient records and reward patients who agree to home visits with gift cards and other financial benefits. This is like the kind of stuff you'd expect from a used car salesman, not a health insurer. You know, the used car salesman calls you up and says, oh, hey, Jack, you bought a car from us 3 years ago, wondering if we can't get you into something nicer. Now you got your health insurance company saying, we've got a $50 gift card to Old Country Buffet with your name on it if you let us send a nurse to your house and diagnose you with AIDS against your doctor's opinion. This is going on, and this is not an isolated thing. Tens of billions of dollars is changing hands this way. Insurers added diabetic cataract diagnoses to 148 patients treated by Dr. Howard Chen. There's the guy we looked at a minute ago. That's an ophthalmologist in Goodyear, Arizona. He said he saw at most 1 or 2 such cases a year. This is kind of the amazing thing. This doctor, 148 of his patients, Medicare Advantage insurers diagnose them with diabetic cataracts, all right, and they collect money doing that, even though this doctor only sees about 2 cases a year of diabetic cataracts. He said that he charges insurers $40 per patient to cover his costs of providing them with medical charts. If they are just making stuff up, then why do they even need or want charts, said Dr. Chen. In all, Medicare paid insurers about $50 billion for diagnoses added just by insurers in just the 3 years ending 2021, the journal analysis showed. Now, the Wall Street Journal does an amazing job here with some of these charts. All right, here is, they're saying the annual pay. The average Medicare Advantage insurer, they get $3,735 from Uncle Sam in order to insure their patients. All right, this is this private-public partnership of Medicare Advantage. The government pays insurers a base rate for each Medicare Advantage members. The insurers are entitled to extra money, though, when their patients are diagnosed with certain conditions that are costly to treat. Remember Charlie Munger's quote, show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome. So now we scroll down a little bit here and they're talking about like morbid obesity. The average payment for a morbidly obese patient in Medicare Advantage rises to $6,105. They get an extra $2,370 to diagnose somebody with morbid obesity. And now let's talk about some of these other things. They're talking about stroke patients, an extra $2,180, prostate cancer, $1,400, kidney disease, $650, chest pain, $1,280, seizures, $2,000, atrial fibrillation, $2,540. All right. The insurers have an incentive to search for additional diagnoses. And the result is that many of their patients seem sicker, at least on paper. And again, this money is coming from the endless, bottomless well of U.S. taxpayer funds, largely funded by Janet Yellen and her treasury bond issuance. So this is affecting the federal deficit, the national debt. So you can get up to $16,267 if you diagnose your patient with all of these ailments that Medicare Advantage has deemed grant you an additional bonus. But it was sick bonuses, right? They're incentivizing illness here. The annual total would be $16,267, but Medicare pays nothing for some diagnoses. But insurers can add ones that do pay, even if a patient's treating doctor doesn't agree. For example, diabetic cataracts. You get $2,863 additional if you're diagnosed with diabetic cataracts. And by you, I mean your health insurance provider, United Health, gets an additional $2,800. But if that cataract diagnosis is just standard old age cataracts, the insurer doesn't get any additional money. Diabetic cataracts are a complication of diabetes that occur when uncontrolled blood sugar damages the lens of the eye, clouding a person's vision. United Health members were 15 times as likely to have that diagnosis as the average patient in traditional Medicare, the journal analysis found. 15 times more likely. So, gee, guys, do you think just maybe United Health is a little quick on the trigger to diagnose people with diabetic cataracts, considering they make an extra $2,000 if they do so? And lo and behold, a United Healthcare patient on Medicare Advantage is 15 times more likely to develop this rare ailment than their ordinary Medicare Advantage or Medicare clientele. And this chart is showing here is the likelihood out of 1,000 beneficiaries. On average, you're going to see 43 cases of diabetic cataracts out of 1,000 of your base case. Out of 10,000 of your base case Medicare patients. But for the average Medicare Advantage, you get 321 diagnoses out of 10,000 beneficiaries. So way more likely on Medicare Advantage. And then United Health specifically, 631 out of 10,000. 15 times more likely to develop diabetic cataracts if you're a United Health Medicare Advantage patient. And this goes on to talk about all of these other diagnoses where there is a financial incentive for this company to call you out of the blue, send a person to your house, bring you a $50 gift card, not tell your doctor, and then all of a sudden, poof, you're more likely to have one of these ailments. And you may not even be told about it. You're definitely not going to get any treatment for it. And look at this, United Health's morbid obesity, all right? Whereas out of 10,000 beneficiaries, the average is 578 morbidly obese patients. For United Health, it's 1,155. For heart failure, out of 10,000 Medicare beneficiaries, 552 experience heart fail. But for United Health, 925. For depression, 299 for the average, 418 for United Health. For emphysema, 155. For the average, 335 for United Health. Need I go on about how United Health is manufacturing diseases, incentivizing people to let people come out to their house and give them a once-over and give them one of these fake diagnoses so that they can rip off the United States taxpayer while this is all going on? And let me just add, this is what United Health Group stock has done since 2008. Oh, I see United Health has made quite a business out of this. Coming out of the GFC, United Health stock was at $23.90, and today they're at $510 as they have collected just in the last 3 years, $50 billion from fake diagnoses on Medicare Advantage plans. And there's one more thing I want to mention, and I had this window open. Let me bring it back up. I lost it just a second ago. Oh man, sorry guys. Me and my hair trigger on my mouse. Here we go. This one. Remember, we were just talking about Steward Healthcare a few minutes ago? Well, take a look at this story. Steward to sell Physicians Group to United Health's Optum Care. As Steward Healthcare, remember, we were just talking about what a wonderful bunch of fellas they are. As they filed for bankruptcy, United Health is looking to get even bigger. They have proposed buying the whole physician network from Steward Healthcare called Optum Care. And I would add that this has not been cleared yet. Regulators are reviewing this merger and this buyout. And well, if you like what Steward has done, and if you like that United Health is ripping off the American taxpayer, adding to our inflation and our national debt and all the other problems that come with it, man, are you just going to love when United Health ends up buying Steward Healthcare's network? This is like the Voltron of medical scumbags. And, well, maybe, I guess it's 2024. Maybe I should say the Megazord of medical scumbags. Maybe more people will get that reference. Voltron's probably a little before most of their times. I'm showing my age here. But guys, this story, again, I told you, this is going to make you want to grind your gears. Isn't it just amazing how these medical insurers, they have an incentive to diagnose people with certain diseases, and all of a sudden, their customers are 15 times as likely to develop that disease. Ladies and gentlemen, UNH, United Healthcare, the biggest component of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That is what I got for that one. Melody, what do you think about this story?
Jack, I have a lot of words, but I want to start by maybe tying a story that you did in the Week in Doom to this as well, because I heard, but I didn't have time to validate, that one of the things that went down theoretically this month was health insurance. When, I mean, in reality, we all know they don't actually track the cost of real health insurance. My health insurance this year went up $100 for, I mean, no reason whatsoever. But wasn't that one of the things that decelerated this month in the CPI?
Yes. As a matter of fact, it was a few months ago, there was a shocking development when all of a sudden the consumer price index for health insurance premiums went from something like positive 2 or 3% in a month to negative 34% year over year, because they changed the way they calculate health insurance premiums based on the earnings of insurance companies. And it's one of the ways that they call it hedonic adjustments. They're constantly changing the way inflation works. And talk about gaslighting the public. When they told us, this was like 3 or 4 months ago is when the story broke, that health insurance premiums had dropped 34% year over year. And I am yet to find a person that isn't dead anyway, whose health insurance premium went down 34%. And even among the dead, I'm sure there's still some people who, you know, if we could talk to them, would tell you their insurance premium somehow went up. But yeah, it's one of the ways that they juke inflation statistics lower by manipulating the data. They changed the health insurance premium calculation based on the way the insurance companies report their earnings. And of course, a lot of people right now are having elective medical procedures done that they put off during COVID. And so the insurers are seeing a lot more demand for their services. And so their earnings have come down, and they made that change right as the earnings are coming down. And so poof, a 34% decline in medical insurance for the CPI math. Ladies and gentlemen, your government statistics at work.
Manufacturing CPI, just like manufacturing disease, right? And so
Yep.
I think, you know, Jack, this story is just so upsetting on so many levels. And I think, you know, the morbidly obese, I kind of remember when that became a diagnosis, because everybody I knew came, you know, was going to getting their physical, and they're like, I'm suddenly morbidly obese. And they were, I think, 20 pounds overweight or something like that. But, you know, you tie that in. Well, did they need that diagnosis so they could get that extra money? And so, guys, just like with everything, our healthcare system is in tatters. And, you know, this is why we kind of talked about your health for sale. Right now, everything is for sale or lease, including your health, you know, our labor, our brains, you know, our data. And so I think this is why we think a show like this is so important, because, you know, that little incident you talked about, Jack, of just calling about your personal situation, we can see this is being borne out in a more national narrative, and what this actually means on a macro level. But I think the most concerning thing about your story is just the fact that we cannot trust when we walk into a doctor's office, we cannot trust that they actually have our interest at heart. They have their own vested interests at heart. And I might suddenly have diabetic cataracts when I don't have diabetes. And just think about the emotional toil that takes on somebody to get a diagnosis like that, and I think this fits really well with kind of your earlier stories on Steward, that we just have a healthcare system that's in total disrepair. Turning over to the comments from the viewers, we didn't have a ton of questions, I think likely because they're just as shocked as I am. And I even read the story, but you took time to go over those charts. And I think, that when I'm reading, sometimes I'm more of a words person and not a visual, but just going through that visual was very effective. But I think some of the things, one question was, when was the article published? If you could answer that quickly.
Yeah, the article was July 11th. Let me verify that, because it says updated July 11th. What was the original date of this? You sent this to me, I believe, on Tuesday, Melody.
Okay.
I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm going to put a link to this
In the show notes.
to this Wall Street Journal. I'll put it in the chat right now, and then I'll go
Okay.
back and I will put it in the description after the fact. But it's there in the chat, the Wall Street Journal. Please don't leave. I just messed up our retention statistics for the algorithm. Oh no, what have I done? But there's the Wall Street Journal article. And again, thank you, Melody, for spotting this one. Monday morning or Tuesday morning is when this came out, and then they updated it Thursday. And again, I mean, if I could just mention here, and again, I don't have a silver bullet for this. I don't have all the answers, guys. All I can tell you is things that are bad ideas, definitely bad ideas. And for all the people who are saying this is why the government should just take over all of healthcare, well, look what happened. The government took it over trying to make it cheap and accidentally created an incentive for scrupulous medical professionals to be bribed and patients to be bribed with freaking gift cards. Why? To rip off the taxpayers. And look at what United Health stock has done. They have made billions off of this. Is anybody any healthier? No, the country's just poorer. We're just more in debt. And so when you introduce government backing, then all of a sudden, all of the fraud and everything becomes backed by this endless stream of printed money that is adding to inflation. That's made everything else from cars and insurance to food and shelter more expensive.
And it's adding to the bezel and the grift, right?
Yeah.
It is actually incentivizing those things. And I think this is the perfect answer to the question we had last week of, we had a viewer say, like, what, there shouldn't be any profit in healthcare. And we sort of said, listen, it's about the incentives. And I think starting out with a Munger quote, who he's unfortunately passed away this year, I think that's an excellent quote to start with, because it's about those incentives. And when you incentivize in this manner, this is exactly what's going to happen. A normal, healthy person is going to be diagnosed with things that they don't have so that companies can get theirs. And so, guys, and then the fact is, if the government takes it over, they're not going to take it over. They're going to outsource it, like, and that's what they've done to many degrees. And so, and then those companies just sit there and enrich themselves, like we saw this week about the $52,000 Boeing trash can, for instance. I'm reminded of back when Gore went on, I think it was David Letterman, and just started talking about all the government spending on ridiculous, stupid things. I don't know if I'm pretty old, so I don't know if other people remember, but that's what we need again, is like all of this government spending has just gotten completely out of control, and it's time to rein all this back in. And our lives and our health is no safer in the hands of the government than it is in the hands of private actors, in my opinion.
And I also think it's important to remember, guys, that politicians and corporate types, executives, play our emotions like a fiddle on this topic. All right. I mean, anybody who comes out and even says anything remotely critical of Medicare Advantage in a political spectrum, well, they won't touch this with a 10-foot pole, because Medicare Advantage is so popular among the people that are on it. And Medicare, anybody who questions Medicare wants to throw grandma off a cliff. Right. And so they play on your emotions here. But let me ask you, there are plenty of things that we would die without: food, heat, shelter. And yet the people who provide these things all make profits. Why should doctors be any different? Why do we treat healthcare different? Because it's our emotions. All right. And look, I understand the way you treat and the way you judge a society. You know, there's a couple of ways you could judge a society, and chief among them, how they treat their prisons and how they treat their sick and their elderly. So, you know, please don't mistake my opinion that the socialists shouldn't be allowed to come take over healthcare for not caring about the well-being of people. I mean, I'm a first responder, guys. Like, I will go provide first aid to somebody for nothing, for free. That's what I do in my spare time when I can, when my back isn't killing me because I couldn't get a freaking scan because the insurance won't pay for it unless there's a tingle down your leg. But man, I just got angry again there, and I lost my train of thought. So we treat healthcare like it should be different. If people are providing a service to you, they deserve to be compensated for you based on the value of that service. And the second the government interferes in that free market transaction, a new variable, profit and grift, is added. And we can see here with United Health what they've done with Medicare Advantage and Steward Health. The more bureaucracy piles in, the more cracks that these weasels can snivel their way into the healthcare system and steal money, right? All the profits are not going to the doctors. All the profits are not going to the nurses. They're going to these executives and these bureaucrats and these administrative people who don't provide any value, because we just keep piling on more rules and regulations, and we just make it easier to steal. And that's what really got my blood up here. They're just stealing. And because Medicare is such a big chunk of our national debt and our deficits, and therefore it is a big chunk of the inflation that we're currently struggling with, because the endless deficits is what's causing the inflation. This affects everything you buy, everything you eat, every single transaction you make is being impacted by this grift in the medical system. And we're going to keep exposing it on this channel. We may not have all the answers on how to fix it, guys, and I don't think anybody really does. But at the very least, we can shine a light on the fraud, and hopefully, I mean, this is so big, and United Health has an army of lobbyists. I hope somebody ends up in jail over this story. At the very least, there's a lot of people who should not be allowed to practice medicine anymore because they're going around handing people gift cards in exchange for diagnoses, and that is another violation of the Hippocratic Oath. And Jack, get off your soapbox.
No, I mean, you know, it is again, both of you, we both got emotional, like you said, even now, just talking about it, because we can think about our instances with ourselves, instances with our family members. You know, and every time we walk into one of these places, we're putting our lives at risk, honestly. But, you know, we're being asked to trust these folks. And when someone like, you know, a private equity firm, and we can see in real statistics, I think I mentioned this book last week, Plunder by Benjamin Bayou, about the fact that you can look at private equity owned hospitals and look at the death rate. It's much higher. And so, you know, this has real world implications. And the other thing I just kind of wanted to mention, Jack, and I think this is a topic important to you as well, is just about morbidity and the fact that, you know, I'm sorry, about gross obesity, and the fact that, you know, this is such a huge problem in our country, and yet we do absolutely nothing really to address it. And, you know, the cheapest food, of course, is the food that is the worst for you. And I saw a really interesting meme the other day about 2 boxes of cereal. One in the United States, the same, I can't remember if it was like Fruit Loops, I don't remember, but it's General Mills. And then what that looked like in Europe, and just the, you know, all of the disgusting fake chemicals in the one in the United States, while the one in Europe didn't have all those ingredients. And so in so many ways in the US, we just, when it comes to our healthcare, we are, there's just not a lot of motivation out there to really fix what ails us.
I can tell you on the topic of food, and you're right. You know, we have a saying in the fire service, because there's so much plastic in the common home now, that the smoke, we say it's full of methyl ethyl bad stuff. You know, it's just a term we invented for all the chemicals and crap that's as the furniture and the drapes and everything are burning. It's just toxic everything. And it really reads like the label on the Fruit Loops box, like you talked about. I mean, that we fill our food with methyl ethyl bad stuff. And, you know, one of the reasons maybe my blood might be up a little more and I'm losing my train of thought is Gigi, my wife, recently went on the carnivore diet, which means I pretty much went on the carnivore diet. So I'm ketosimifying right now as we speak. My body's like, feed me carbs. I'm angry you won't give me your carbs. And so, it's supposedly the keto flu only lasts for a couple of days, and I'm going to come at it smiling and happy. I don't know. But, Raymond's talking about eating healthy is expensive. And, Raymond, I really wonder, how expensive is it? Yeah, meat prices are going higher and things like that. But when you eat unhealthy and you can add the cost of healthcare and, the cost of being sick and the quality of life you miss out on, eating healthy actually becomes a lot cheaper. And also keep in mind all that processed garbage. Every time a process is done to something, energy, labor, and ingredients are put into it. And those things aren't free. Those things all cost money. So this myth that processed foods are cheaper, I think is not real. I think it's maybe you can get more volume for the same money when you eat that processed crap, but most of it's essentially cardboard. I mean, the cheapest food you ever buy, you're going to find in the meat section and the fresh produce. I think those center aisles full of that processed crap, it might appear cheaper, but it's not. Trust me.
Absolutely. Stay away from the center aisles.
Yeah.
And grow some veggies. That's the way you can make it a little cheaper.
Yeah.
All right, Jack. So I think that was it from questions from the group. Should we take it out here, or any last words that you would like to share?
We can take a couple of questions from the group, guys. Fire away if you got any. But the one thing I'd just add, a couple of common themes that we saw today was really the grift and the greed, right? I mean, in pretty much everything, you got the Japanese government intervening in Forex market, rigging trades to cause stop losses among Forex speculators. Obviously, Steward Healthcare, just unbelievable fraud there. United Health was like, hold my beer. You got a lack of preparation in the power grid while politicians are on jaunts overseas. Really, guys, higher standards of leadership. We need to be more vigilant for fraud. We need to be more vocal about it when we find it. We need to stop just accepting that this is the way it is and be more vocal about demanding accountability in all aspects of life. And, it's the only way we're ever going to even make a dent in some of these problems. And unfortunately, it is the golden age of grift. And I would just caution that it always seems like give the government more power is the answer. And yet every time we do that, the grift seems to get worse. So maybe we try it a little differently this way. I just throw it out there. You guys do what you want with it. And I do see we got a couple of question marks starting to appear. Raymond, thank you, Raymond, the pithy unaffiliated identifier. He says, what are your thoughts on current unemployment? Do you buy the unemployment about to explode narrative? Melody, I'll give you the first crack at this one.
And so I think that we are starting to see layoffs. I don't exactly buy our employment rate right now, just because we know about all the people that are missing from the workforce. But you are definitely seeing layoffs escalate. I mean, it's everywhere now. You're seeing bankruptcies increase. And so I definitely do believe that we are going to start to see unemployment on the rise.
And Raymond, I'll take a crack at this one as well. I just put out a thread on X. I'm at JG_nuke on X. And I also put it out on my channel, Nobody Special Finance, yesterday in my afternoon live stream. I think the big difference in the trends that we saw between CPI and PPI this week that we talked about during this Week in Doom segment, we've got PPI rising as CPI falls. And right in between, you got consumer prices and producer prices, and that area in between is profit margins. And as producer prices rise and consumer prices rise slower, the margins are getting squeezed because people are demanding higher wages because the wage increases of the last year and a half have not kept pace with inflation. So employers' costs are rising astronomically right now. And what we've seen with a lot of the earnings, like from PepsiCo this week and Delta Airlines and Lufthansa and Target and Walmart, they can't pass those costs onto the consumer anymore because the consumer is broke. The producers no longer have pricing power. And so what does a producer do when his costs are going up and he can't raise his prices? He starts cutting people. And I think that's the takeaway from those inflation prints that we got this week. With producer prices rising faster than consumer prices, profit margins are being compressed. That means layoffs are coming. They've already started. And unemployment is right now, I believe it's at 4% right now. I think we are months away from a dramatic spike in unemployment. And historically, spikes in unemployment follow within a few months of the first rate cut, which they're saying will probably happen in September here. So yes, I am absolutely buying the narrative on unemployment about to explode. The current narrative on unemployment, I won't comment on the numbers themselves, but I think the current narrative of the strength in the job market is ill-advised, to say the least. I don't think the job market is nearly as strong as they claim it is. If it was, we would see wages rising faster than consumer prices, because the cost of labor doesn't get cheaper relative to everything else if the demand for labor is higher than the supply. But we're not seeing that. Labor is getting cheaper relative to other stuff, which means the demand for labor is not as strong as they're telling us. It's basic economics. You can debunk this myth of the strong labor market. And you can manipulate it the way they count unemployment and people marginally attached to the labor force and U6, U3, and labor force participation. Government statistics, right? Lies, damn lies, and statistics. You can manipulate it any way you want. That was a good question, though. Thank you, Raymond. I got another one here from Tim McLean. Will J-Powell give the market lower rates in September? What do you think, Mel?
I'll let you take this one as well, Jack. I mean, I just remember very clearly in December sitting around a table with a bunch of economists that were convinced he was about to drop rates. And I was a little suspect. I honestly, I don't know. I think that it depends really on what happens. I don't think anybody can say that for sure right now, but maybe you feel otherwise.
I think definitely September now. I really do.
Okay.
I think for the same reason. I think the hundreds of academics at the Fed see that rise in PPI and the fall in CPI, and they can see what that means. I also think that, Powell's own words, he's told us that their two mandates, maximum employment and inflation or price stability, are in better balance now, which means he's paying as close attention to the labor data as the inflation data. And the labor data is getting worse while the inflation data gets better. So that, to me, tells me labor data is now more important than inflation, which means more likely to see a rate cut. And the odds of a rate cut went up this week, as shown on the CME Group's Fed Watch tool. The interest rate futures are pricing in a near certainty now of the September rate hike. It's something like 89% that they cut in September. So I think, yes, I do think we get the lower rates in September, and I don't think it's really going to matter, to be honest with you. 25 basis points will not solve the problems that we have right now. Let me see. Do we have any more question marks in the chat here? I do see a lot of comments. I love the pithiness of the comments. Let's see. Sheila Grace is saying 25 basis points, maybe. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking, Sheila. We do have some people starting to say things about maybe the possibility of a 50 basis point cut. I don't think they'll do 50. I think they'll do 25. And then the question becomes, do they do 25, 25, 25, or do they skip a meeting and do 25 every other? So that's important. We've got, how do I pronounce that? Eclair Trio saying, what will happen with housing and unemployment with all the influx of visitors, obviously making reference to immigration. I'll take the first stab at this one. When you bring in more people, all right, let's just look at this pragmatically from a supply and demand standpoint. All right, it's an emotionally charged subject, but let's be pragmatic. More people means more demand for things like food, housing, shelter, utilities. Okay, so the impact on inflation is higher when you bring in people as far as demand. Now, the impact on unemployment, you're adding labor supply when you bring in more people. All right. And if the demand stays the same, that means the price of labor is going to come down. So I think we're looking at consumer price inflation, and we're looking at suppression in wages with the influx of migrants into the country. And so the net effect of that, when you send consumer prices higher while damping the impact on wages, is the wealth gap gets bigger, the gap between the poor and the wealthy in this country. I think that's why when you go on CNBC and Bloomberg, they always celebrate the influx of migrants as if to say, well, inflation would be much worse if we didn't have these people coming in. But what inflation? The wages would be higher. And why is inflation hurting the middle class so much right now? Because the wages aren't rising as fast as consumer prices. So yeah, Bloomberg's core audience and CNBC's core audience, the ownership class, they're making out like bandits because the consumer prices are being made worse while the wages are being suppressed, which goes directly into their accounts, but everybody else suffers from it. So Mel, do you want to take a crack at this one too, or?
Well, so I largely agree with everything you say, Jack. And I think from housing in particular, what I would say is that, in essence, they're already here to some degree. And I think this is what I think a lot of people miss is that actually we need to look in the rearview mirror of what's happened. Because a lot of people, because they're just learning about this issue, just learning how many, it was only a couple of months ago that people looked at employment statistics and could see that it was a lot of foreign-born workers that were participating as well. So I think that we have to understand. I don't think there's going to be a huge sea change in the future. I think what's happening now is you're hearing even the Democrats talking about slowing down immigration, and so I think that from here it should actually slow. Would you disagree with that, Jack?
Yeah, I think I think it was something of a game changer when the southern states started busing the people into the sanctuary cities, because you see a lot of these cities, they didn't like 15 minutes being a border town. After telling the border towns for years that they were a bunch of hate mongers for having an issue with immigration, you see how their tune changed almost instantly when the busloads of people started showing up in their backyard. Now it's a bunch of NIMBYism, and they're putting pressure on their elected officials to do something about it now. And that's why I think you're seeing a little more common ground start to be established between the two parties on immigration. Still a big gap between the two of them, but it's narrowing here.
Absolutely. And it's really hard to talk about because the numbers are so hard to decipher. I've actually been working on this story since we did that Colony Ridge piece, and it's just difficult to get good numbers, good data on this. So it's hard to make calls about what's going to happen in the future. But I think what I want most to understand is that it's already here. It's already happened. We're already dealing with it.
And Deborah had a good question there, asking, are migrants included in the unemployment numbers? And that's a little hard to answer, Deb. Let me take a stab at it. Keep in mind, there's two different surveys when you hear the jobs report. You've got the establishment survey, which counts businesses filling positions, and you've got the household survey, which counts people working jobs. And the establishment survey keeps showing tremendous job gains, because when we call up businesses and say, did you hire anybody this month? They say yes or no. They don't say whether or not they hired a citizen or a non-citizen. They just say, I filled a position. So I think migrants who are coming here and working are adding to these jobs numbers as they fill positions. But then when you look at the household survey, that shows this massive job loss in full-time jobs being offset by gains in part-time jobs. I think U.S. citizens are far more likely to answer the phone and give the data about their working situation than somebody who's in the country illegally. So I think the household survey is not counting illegal immigrants in the country. And so you're only counting the native-born workers, which have been in big-time decline over the last few years. So I think the jobs number, the establishment survey headline number, does include them. The household number doesn't. So I think it's having an outsized effect in certain parts of the data. And that's when you really got to parse those attachments and those tables and the jobs reports and read how they calculate the methodology. It's reflected in some numbers and not in others. But I think the biggest place it's reflected right now is the gap between wage increases and consumer price inflation. I think that's where migration is really showing up. But that was another excellent question. We got time for one more here. Let me see. Well, I'm looking for question marks.
There was a question from Eddie Lou about whether immigrants can buy property. So
I don't know. There's no citizenship questions when you go to buy a house, right? I mean, there's plenty of foreign ownership. I know Chinese investors have been coming in, Japanese investors have been coming in and buying property. So there's no barriers to preventing someone in the country illegally from owning property. So I'm going to say yes.
It would just be their qualifications, right? I think that, so I've been hearing just recently, I was on a Spaces yesterday hearing about in Illinois, people like pooling together and, buying homes. This is a story I want to dive into because I do believe that this is actually happening, that you've got foreign born workers participating in the housing market. Yesterday on the Spaces, they were actually talking about people that have fled from Ukraine as well, because it's not just people from, the south of our border. And so I do believe that there is participation in the housing market. I believe it's very difficult to size right now, but it's definitely a story that I'm working on.
And it's definitely adding to rental demand. Even if it's not adding
Yes.
to buyers, it's adding to demand for shelter, which is affecting rents, which affects prices. So it does have an effect.
Right. And you can look at Colony Ridge, yes, that was a big scheme and fraud, but all of those immigrants got loans through those two brothers in Colony Ridge.
And the last question we'll take here, we're getting a little long. I'll take this one from Arvin. Arvin Sick, did I say the name right, Arvin? He says, how is the rapid increase in automated and software replacement for human jobs going to affect the value of labor? Is it a potentially larger impact than immigration? You want the first crack at this, Melly?
No, you go for it.
All right. Let me just say, when it comes to job displacement, I'm not much of a Luddite. My buddy Joe Brown over at Heresy Financial, excellent channel. I highly recommend him. He's done a pretty good spiel about how, go back in time 100,000 years, 200,000 years, 100% of the human race was engaged in hunter-gathering for a profession or childcare, right? 100% of the human race was hunter-gatherers. And then a few years later, we invented farming. And now one person with a farm can feed hundreds of people. Dozens of people will say farming wasn't great. We'll say one person with a farm can feed dozens of people. Did all the hunter-gatherers sit around and do nothing? Did they go on universal basic income because the farmers, they didn't have to hunt, gather anymore? Not really. You had things like blacksmiths started to develop, and we had art and music, and now there were other, like carpenters started building nicer homes because they didn't have to spend all their time hunting and gathering, right? So this technology innovation displaced a lot of hunter-gatherers, but other industries rose to fill that gap. And then the Industrial Revolution and the steam engine came, and now instead of 80% of the population engaged in farming, now only like 3% of the population is engaged in farming. Did everybody else just go on universal basic income? No, now we have whole industries. People work in factories, travel, whole entertainment industries, right? Quality of life got better. Now people are spending money providing leisure. Hospitality becomes an industry. There was no such thing as that when we were hunter-gatherers. So I guess the point is, innovation always displaces jobs, but at the same time, because of innovation, we have more time, and people are smart enough to figure out something productive to do with their time. I think it's a little narrow-minded and, dare I say, a little arrogant and conceitful for these AI monkeys that are out there saying, we need to pass universal basic income because my software is going to put all of you stupid peasants out of work, and you just need to, take the little scraps that I give you. How arrogant it is to think that people won't be able to find productive other uses of their time. And that's on top of the fact that I think 99% of what these rock star CEOs in AI are promising is outright BS. I think these guys are frauds, hucksters, grifters. They make promises they can't possibly deliver on. And while AI is an exciting new technology, it is nowhere near capable of what they are claiming it's going to do. And I think that bubble is going to burst in a big way. Is it potentially a larger impact on labor than immigration? Potentially, maybe, yes. Not anytime soon. I think some jobs are going to get displaced. I think some jobs are going to get displaced prematurely, and people are going to realize maybe we shouldn't have fired our whole customer service team because this chatbot does a lousy job. And then they're going to end up hiring a lot of them back. But that's my take on AI and the labor displacement.
Yeah. And I'll just add, having worked in technology during the COVID boom, and, and actually I've been working in it for a lot of my career, this is nowhere near the place where it can displace all these jobs. I mean, you still need humans, and honestly, you need humans almost more now to kind of decipher these large language models. And until, honestly, we crack quantum computing, there's no way AI can have the effects that everyone is hoping that it can. It just takes too many resources.
I agree wholeheartedly. And guys, we're coming up on 2 hours here. So I just want to say real quick, thank you so much to Raymond, the pithy unaffiliated identifier.
Love it.
Raymond the Pui, I guess we could call him the PUI. Thank you so much, Raymond, for the super chat and support of the channel. I really appreciate that very much, as well as the good vibes and the kind words. I also want to say thank you to Melody. You've done awesome. Thank you for your research and your commentary. I appreciate that very much. Also, once again, I got to wish a speedy recovery to our buddy Travis. May this massive boo-boo heal. Let me know, is the tourniquet off, or are we going to have to go ahead and amputate, brother? I don't know, but that shark really took a big chunk out of you, Travis. Thoughts and prayers, buddy. Travis is such a good sport, by the way, guys. We bust on him all the time. He is such a good sport. He's got a good jaw. He takes it all in stride. Thank you, Travis, for being so cool. We miss you, brother, and we hope to have you back next week. Melody, and I'll give you the last word. Anything you want to mention?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you as well, Jack. I think, we were both a little nervous about coming here without Travis. He is kind of like our glue. So we do miss you, Travis. But thank you, Jack. Thank you for the wonderful stories. I mean, just enlightening in the way that you can dive into them, slow it down, and really bring it home, the impact that this has to us in our everyday lives. So I'm so appreciative of that. But guys, thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate the support. We believe in this mission. We think it's important to not only just bring you the stories that are out there, but dive into them, show you those narratives that are under the surface and what they can mean for your life every day. So thank you us for joining us this week. And just always remember, math matters.